Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to strawberry fields. Nothing is real, and nothing to get hung about. Strawberry fields forever. Living is easy with eyes. Because the world is round, it turns me on. Because the world is round.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Phillips. I chose to do this as my special project, that is to re-record two Beatle classics, to test the limits of digital audio workstations, to test the claims of manufacturers that you have a whole studio on your computer, and to see if it was possible to simulate production techniques in a modern way within the confines of a digital audio workstation. This is the story of how these songs were made. After purchasing the book, The Complete Beatles Score, I started to sequence the track into my digital audio workstation Sonar. I tackled the task of sequencing by starting at the start, which was to sequence the mellotron flutes. This progressed to the drums, and then finally the cellos. A number of things were decided before all this began. The Dimension Pro sampling instrument was going to be my main instrument simulator, and Session Drummer 3, my drum machine. One thing became abundantly clear whilst making these two tracks. That was, I was going to have to wear three hats: producer, artist, and audio scientist. As previously stated, the flutes are where I began this project. They are an important part of the track, my version and the Beatles version. Also, it is one of the objectives of this project to test the virtual mellotron, one of the first sample-based instruments available. Whilst the virtual mellotron is louder and cleaner, it still retains all the characteristics of the real mellotron. This includes tape hiss and tape wow and flutter. You can hear this at the very beginning of the Strawberry Fields introduction. Finally, as proof that this is an accurate representation of the mellotron, Rick Wakeman, keyboard player with the band Yes, endorses this virtual mellotron. He should know because he recorded some of the original samples included with the Mellotron Mark I in 1963. As audio producer of this project, and as an audio producer full stop, I tend to mix as I go. A number of things were attempted to make the flutes sound like they had been played rather than sequenced. I used the MIDI effects Quantize and Velocity. I will discuss these effects later in this film. Suffice to say, they were not affected with this instrument. What the virtual mellotron had that the original did not was attack and release sliders. By employing these effects, some realism to the sequence was added, although how much is debatable. I also added a filter over the top to add some more hiss and crunch. And finally, I used a channel tool plugin. This allowed me to pan the flutes hard left at the start of the track as the Beatles original. It also allowed me to pan the flutes left to right, right to left in the outro, also as in the original. The final thing that needs to be discussed about the flutes is the outro, and the flute refrain that is reversed as in the Beatles original. To me, this is one of the least effective parts of the track, due to the fact that when you reverse tape, it tends to make a sucking sound, something that is lacking on my version. However, on the new M-Tron version, which has just been released, and I have not brought, there is a reverse switch. This, I think, would have added the sucking sound that is missing from my version. At this point, the flutes were ready to be mixed into the track. I think it is safe to say that Objective 3 of this project, which was to test the virtual mellotron, has been proven. The virtual mellotron can replace the hardware mellotron. The drums are one of the most successful parts of this project. It was also one of the objectives of this project. That was, can a virtual drummer replace the real thing? A number of experiments were conducted to achieve what I believe to be an accurate simulation of a drummer, and in this case, Ringo Starr. The first thing I did was detune the drums 2 octaves. This was to achieve the key of the track. In the original Beatles version, because of the slowed down tape effect, the drums are slightly lower than normal. This is where a decision was made as the producer of the track. For the drums to be a true accurate representation of the original, I should have pitched the track up 2 octaves rather than down 2 octaves for the first section. The next thing I did was add a filter to the snares and the toms to achieve Ringo's famed muffled drum sound. And to give the drums punch, I added a tape saturation effect. Finally, in keeping with the objectives of the project, I applied MIDI effects. These MIDI effects help simulate or humanise virtual instruments. Whilst on the final mix very little quantize effects was used, the velocity effect really changed the feel of the drums. This is where once again I used my producer's hat, and perhaps I should have done some more experimentation, but what I did do was use the Quantize plugin to great effect, in particular on the percussion and double tom hits. What this did was give those instruments their own place in the mix. Even if they are in front of the beat or behind, as in the case with the percussion, these effects really do help simulate or humanise virtual instruments, and in this case, the drums and the percussion. Even if the listener is not fooled into believing a real person has recorded these instruments, these effects add what I like to call a digital flavour, and this is part of this new digital paradigm. The final thing that needs to be said about the drums is that I mixed them in mono. I did this because, as in the original, they too were in mono. The only difference is that they were panned hard left, and I've kept mine dead centre. I have, though, with the double tom hits, kept these in stereo. This was a producer-artist decision, and once again, perhaps I should have been wearing my scientist's hat. In the scheme of things, though, I believe you can successfully simulate a drummer with a virtual drum machine. The cellos on Strawberry Fields caused me the biggest problems. This was for a number of reasons. One being I did not have a full sample library. This would have included backwards and forwards cello bowing. I used 3 different cello types and sounds, and I added some tube distortion, by way of an effect included on the Dimension Pro instrument. This was to help simulate tube microphones used in the day. I also added a slight amount of ambient reverb. This was to add texture to the overall cello sound, or to simulate the sound waves bouncing off the wood of the cello. The final thing that needs to be discussed about the cellos is the mixing. Once again, the effects quantize and velocity were used. These effects help randomize the notes enough so that when you hear the cellos in the mix, it gives the cellos a sense of realism. The final thing that needs to be discussed in terms of the virtual instruments are the trumpets and the sitar. Suffice to say that both instruments had very little done to them in terms of effects. The trumpet reverb is an effect included on the Dimension Pro instrument. Both had some quantize and velocity, but apart from that, because they worked, I left them as they sounded. In terms of the real instruments, the first thing that I did was tackle the bass. Using my Epiphone Hofner replica and my Art Pro VLA2 compressor, I set about learning the part. This is where I started to learn how to use the Audio Snap palette. This tool, as I have already stated, allows you to quantize audio like MIDI. Once again, without this tool, as heard in the opening passage, the bass would not have been as tight. This, I think, proves that as a correction tool, the Audio Snap palette is invaluable and does allow an average musician the ability in the studio to become more than competent and to fool the listener that the musician is competent. At this point, I started to experiment with virtual effects simulations on the bass. I used the Teletronics LA2 leveler and the Pultec EQ unit. Suffice to say that although the effect is subtle, they do add something to the overall sound, the caveat being how well these plugins were made. The argument against these emulators is that you can never replicate the sound of audio passing through the circuits of an actual audio processor. Whilst this may be the case, the reality is that they do add something, even if it is subtle. And this again proves that we are in a new age of recording. Just as engineers use tape to add flavour to recordings from a bygone age, the engineer today has to understand how to add these new flavours to our digital recordings.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going